Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on trade and the real economy. First, you are going to hear from Dennis Novy of the University of Warwick. Dennis, are you there?
Yes, hello, hi.
Okay, now you're going to be talking about the evidence on how the Brexit vote affected exchange rates and consumer prices. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Tim. And I will talk about exchange rates and consumer prices after Brexit. And I should stress here that this is joint work with Holger Breinlich from the University of Surrey, Elsa Levermont, who is at UC Louvain in Belgium, and Thomas Sampson from the London School of Economics. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Now, just to set the scene, a lot of people have talked about Brexit and how it might be bad for the economy, depending on what kind of deal the UK might get with the EU in the end. But most of those studies were predictions, forecasts. So what happens in a soft Brexit and a hard Brexit? So what we do in this paper is not a forecast. We look at actually what has already happened to the British economy. And the story is, well, if you go to the first slide, Tim, everybody can see that the pound went down in the night of referendum. And that's simply because financial markets were surprised by this outcome. In the middle of the night, as the counts came in Sunderland and then other counting areas, the pound dropped very quickly. And you can see here in this picture that the pound went down by about 10%. So this is an effective exchange rate. It's actually a basket of bilateral exchange rates against sterling. And that happened in the night. And then what's quite remarkable is that this depreciation of the pound was also persistent. This picture only goes to July 2017, but if you go all the way back to today, end of 2019, you will see that the pound has remained about 10% down. Now, what's also remarkable is that this happens very rarely. In exchange rate markets, you don't see such big movements very much. You sometimes see them with less developed economies, Mexico, Argentina, but less so for a pretty rich country like the UK. And what's also interesting is this is all anticipation, because Brexit obviously hasn't happened yet. Tariffs haven't arisen. There have been no restrictions to FDI or migration. So this is all in anticipation. What we try to do in this paper is then figure out, okay, how does this affect consumer prices in the UK? Tim, if you go to the next slide, you can see here a hint of what's coming. The dashed line is the same as in the previous graph, which is the exchange rate index, and obviously you can see the depreciation here. The solid line is import prices in the UK. Everything normalized to 100 in this picture at the day of referendum. And you can see that import prices track the exchange rate quite closely. What this suggests is that at the same time that the exchange rate went down, imports into the UK became more expensive. And that's the story that we want to look at. How does this increase in prices, because you now have to pay more in foreign currency, feed through to consumer prices? If we go to the next slide, Tim, you can see that really this is something that seems quite special about the UK. What we have here is the consumer price index in levels in the UK, that is the solid line, and the same consumer price index, but for the euro area. And everything is normalized again to 100 at the time of referendum, June 2016. And clearly prices in the UK rose faster. So what we pick up here is not something that happened to import prices in general all over the world or in different other countries. No, this is quite specific to the UK. And on the next slide, there is an overview of precisely what we can exploit in the data. Because what we look at is to what extent different industries or different products are exposed to imports. Now let's look at restaurants and hotels as an example. That's towards the bottom. And you can see there that the total import share on the right-hand side is 17%. So that means everything that people spend on restaurants, if you go to a restaurant in the UK, on average, the import content will be 17%. So for example, if you go to a restaurant and they used imported vegetables or imported fish, and that's what you end up eating, 17% of that expenditure that you pay in general will be down to those imports. The rest will be mainly local services. You have to pay the cooks, the staff, and rent, and so on. Now, if you compare this to another industry, towards the top, we have clothing and footwear. That's quite different. The number there is 49%. So what this tells you is almost half of our expenditure on clothing and footwear is directly because of imports. Most of our clothing is imported from foreign countries. Not much of it is produced in the UK, and that's why you have a pretty high share. If you wonder why is the share not 80 or 90%, well, because there are retail costs. For example, clothes are sold in stores, and that has cost. There needs to be transportation and so on as well. So these are domestic inputs, staff costs as well. That's why you don't get up to 80 or 90%. But we can look at those differences across these different industries or divisions, as they're called here in this data set. And that gives us a sense of how the exchange rate operates, because the more you are dependent on the exchange, on imports, say in clothing and footwear, the more we would expect the exchange rate to hit you and to be reflected in higher prices. And on the next slide, we have actually a nice cut of the data precisely along those lines. What we did there is we looked at the inflation rates, but just split the sample in the middle into those goods that are very much dependent on imports. So the top 50% of the highest import shares, that would be the solid line. And then the dashed line, the dark dashed line, is the remaining 50%, those goods or industries that are not so dependent on the exchange rate, like restaurants. And you can clearly see a big difference here, right? So from the time of the referendum, the high import share type of industries, they had much higher inflation rates. You can see that here. Inflation was about 5% or so, starting in early 2017 for those goods. But nothing was happening to those other goods where imports don't really matter. The inflation rate was pretty moderate there, 0 or 1%. And then in gray, just as a comparison, you can see the same sort of picture for the euro area. And there, even for high import shares in the euro area, not much was happening. So again, that tends to suggest, well, there is something specific happening to the UK, and it probably has to do with imports. Okay, and then we look at this a bit more formally, and I'm going to spare you the details and regressions and statistical analysis in the background. But on the next slide, we can see what the ultimate effects will be also on wages. Because what you can see here, prior to the referendum, you can see that, well, nominal wage growth was nice and positive, between 2 and 3%. That's the solid, the dark black line. And inflation was very low. Therefore, real wages were also quite positive, 2% or 1.5% before the referendum. Now, after the referendum, because of this increase in inflation, real wages went down. You can see here that from early 17 onwards, for about 1 year, real wages were negative. That means what people can afford to buy with the wages that they get paid actually was less, right? So that's pretty bad news for households. On the next slide, you can see how different households were affected, because we know what different households spend their money on. This is based on the data. We have about 5,000 households. And not everyone spends the same fraction of their income on restaurants or food. That varies across households, both depending on how rich they are or perhaps where they live. But on average, you can see the inflation rate is something like 3% here, if you look at the middle of the distribution. But we can say a bit, some things that are a bit more detailed. And on the next slide, you can see that. This is the difference across households by income. So we have the lowest 10% on the left-hand side, that's the number one, then the next 10%, that's the number 2, and then on the very right-hand side, the 10 means the 10 richest percent of households in the UK. And this tells you how the inflation rate is different. Now, I should add here that the zero line represents the average increase for the UK, which is 2.9 percentage points. That means inflation was 2.9 percentage points higher on average for the UK. And you can see that there's not much difference across households depending on whether they're poor or rich. Let me give you an example. On the very right-hand side, we have this number minus 0.03. If the average is 2.9 percentage points, that means for the richest 10%, the inflation rate would have been 2.87, which is very, very close to 2.9. And you can see those numbers are pretty small here. That means there is really not much difference. Both poor and rich households were hit by the same way, 2.9 percentage points. What I should say here, 2.9 percentage points, if you try to tell that to some friend who is not an economist, they might actually not quite know what to make out of that number. That's about £870 more for the average household spending per year. And what I want to stress here, it's a permanent cost, because prices have gone up. It's not that after 1 year prices go down again. Given that the exchange rate hasn't moved, prices have remained at that level. That's £870 per household per year. And if you translate that for the entire UK economy, it's about £23.5 billion. And I can give you another translation, because we all remember the red battle bus that the Leave campaign used in early 2016 in the referendum campaign, where they said, we send about £250 million to the EU every week. That number was widely discussed at the time as being misleading. But what we find, just as a point of comparison, we find that the UK actually pays £450 million per week, every week, because of that exchange rate depreciation, higher consumer prices. So it's not that we pay out, we give up £250 million. Actually, we lose £450 million through that effect alone. So that's quite sizable. And then the next slide, which I believe is the last one, and I'm going to stop then, is how this differs across regions. Why we've just seen that it doesn't differ across households by income group. Here you can see there are differences across regions. On the very right-hand side, we have Northern Ireland. And there you can see the inflation increase in Northern Ireland is a bit larger. Instead of 2.9, it's actually, you have to add 0.39, so that would be 3.29%. So inflation, the hit in Northern Ireland was a bit stronger. And on the very left, you can see London, where actually the inflation hit was weaker, so a bit less than 2.9%. Everyone got hit, but people in London got hit a little bit less. And the reason why people in London got hit less is actually quite simple. People in London tend to spend a larger fraction of their income on non-tradable things, like restaurants, rent in particular. We all know renting is expensive, house prices are high in London. That's why London is not as exposed to international trade and imported goods as, say, Northern Ireland or Wales. So there is a bit of a distributional variation across the UK. So I'm going to stop there, but the last thing probably I'm going to say is that this channel of how the exchange rate depreciation has led to higher consumer prices, even though Brexit hasn't happened yet, is actually the major reason why the economy has weakened in the UK. There are other reasons, in particular business investment, but it turns out, as far as we can tell, that quantitatively that's not as important as this channel through higher consumer prices, at least not yet. I think I'm going to leave it there, Tim. Thank you very much, and I'd be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dennis. And if anyone does have a question for Dennis, please get typing. I got a couple of questions that were submitted earlier, Dennis, and one of those is that, as you say, this has been the major contributor to the weakness in the economy, but yet it hasn't been part of the discussion. It's been very much in the background, hasn't it? How do you explain that?
I think that's right. Well, it's a creeping effect, right? The exchange rate goes down, and then prices need some time to adjust. So actually only by early 2017, like half a year after the referendum, you could actually notice it in supermarkets, but you have to look very carefully, right? I mean, the average person is busy, they have a life, and they will not study prices with magnifying glasses once they enter the supermarket. It's just not something that is very obvious. You have to pay a bit of attention. And it's unfortunately not a story that is so dramatic as, what was it? At some point, Marmite was off the Tesco shelf, right? Which probably doesn't matter for the economy at large,
Yes.
but that hit the headlines. But this story is probably not quite as sexy, but it's very important.
Yes, and also this is a once in a lifetime opportunity, isn't it? This you are not going to get the chance to be able to do this again with any of the further developments in Brexit.
Well, remains to be seen, but so
So
far,
it depends
that's
how
not a fact.
unexpected they are. Yes, we can't count out any more surprises.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's, as I said, it's very unusual for these sort of exchange rate movements of that size and of that persistence in a developed economy like the UK. So in some sense, it's a unique window, right? I mean,
Mm.
the dismal signs, economists again, right? I mean, it's obviously bad news for the average consumer in the UK, but at least there's something interesting for economic research in it.
Yes, that's it. And we do see at the moment in the UK, we do see the exchange rate bouncing around all the time, depending on the latest Brexit news. So it obviously is still very sensitive to Brexit news and what's potentially going to happen. It's just that it won't be a shock anymore of this magnitude.
I think that's right. I mean, exchange rates obviously go down every day or go up every day. They can be volatile, but firms usually don't react to day-to-day exchange rate movements. But they would certainly react to what they perceive as a big and certainly a permanent change, presumably.
Thank you, Dennis, for that. And